Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're watching Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. In this episode, I'm pleased to be joined again by author Leigh Bardugo. She's well known for her expansive Grishaverse series of young adult fantasy novels, including the original Shadow and Bone trilogy, the Six of Crows duology, and the King of Scars duology. Outside of the Grishaverse, she has also released an official Wonder Woman novel and the supernatural thriller Ninth House. Today, we'll be talking about her latest release, The Lives of Saints. This lavishly illustrated collection explores the religious folklore of the Grishaverse through short tales of miracles and martyrdom. Leigh was unable to do video for this interview, so I'll be showing you some of that beautiful artwork as the audio plays. Grishaverse fans will recognize some familiar names among the saints within, and indeed the book itself is a real-world manifestation of an object carried by a beloved character. The Lives of Saints is out now from Imprint, a division of Macmillan Books. And Leigh, welcome back to Fictitious.
Thank you so much for having me back.
So the last time that we talked, you were promoting The Language of Thorns, which is another illustrated anthology collection, short story collection. And I will say this only mildly sucking up. I love that book, and it has been on display in our living room ever since it came out.
I'm sad, but you know what? I also can't really take credit for it, so I can enjoy the sucking up because it was really that cover is the work of our art director Natalie Souza, who created this incredible, beautiful object, and worked with Sarah Kippen, who did all the interior illustrations to make it. I think it's just a gorgeous book, and I can say that proudly because all I did is say yay or nay.
Well, and yeah, it is beautiful, but also the stories inside are beautiful. So the combination, I think it's a rare thing these days to get, something that's put together of that combination of prose and artwork in that way. I feel like some ways it's almost anachronistic in the present day. And so it really is a lovely book. And so when I heard about The Lives of Saints, I was really interested to see what you were going to do. I want to say it's a similar concept. I mean, it's a short story collection, but it's a very different animal from Language of Thorns. What would you say is your sort of like elevator pitch for what The Lives of Saints is?
Well, Lives of Saints is a little bit different than my ordinary works that I've had to have a kind of polished pitch for. But, it's 28 stories of miracles and martyrdoms from all over the Grishaverse. And some are bloody, some are funny, some are romantic. But yeah, they are sort of an encapsulation of a lot of the religious lore of the Grishaverse.
Language of Thorns had a lot to do with folklore and kind of played on ideas from Grimm's fairy tales. And even there's a prominent story at the end of it about mermaids that's kind of echoes Hans Christian Andersen, but takes this into your world and develops out in a very different, very dark kind of way. And I say that with a happiness in my voice because I really like that story and I like dark turns.
I mean, I will say that the original Little Mermaid is extremely dark.
Oh, yeah.
So this is dark in a different way, although it's interesting you bring that up because when I went back to do my research for Language of Thorns, there's a deep religious core to that story that I had completely forgotten and that has been erased by kind of the Disney version of the story. But there's a sort of deep religious idea about mermaids not having souls and how they earn a soul and kind of the transactional nature of getting to live forever, which I had completely blanked on. So if anyone's interested in going back and reading that story, it's incredibly creepy and strange.
I like that you kind of bring that up too about the fact that religious imagery and thematics, they do permeate so much of our folklore and just the mythology that builds up around our civilizations. I was watching a video recently that was talking about how all of the art of certain periods, Middle Ages and beyond, in Europe, it could all be referred to as religious art because there really wasn't any other being made that was being released into the world in any significant way because everything filtered through the church and you really could not be a secular person in those societies.
Yeah, there were no secular. I mean, that is so true, and that is a really interesting way of looking at the way we talk about lore now. Because I think, particularly in YA, maybe less so now, but for a very long time, there was almost an aversion to handling religion, and I think that's not for lack of interest or craft, but because that tends to set off alarm bells for a lot of parents and librarians who can be gatekeepers for this work. Or maybe not. Maybe there's a deeper discussion to be had about the way that religion is handled in young adult fiction. But for me, it's always been a big part of the Ravkan world, the Fjerdan world, because I know very few societies that function without some kind of system of belief, whatever your relationship to that system of belief is. For me, it provided this very interesting way to build out characters in terms of their relationship to superstition, to real faith, to their sense of themselves in the world in relationship to power. And I think it's always an interesting question when magic is at play, how that relates to the idea of a miracle or the idea of these kind of transformative or inexplicable moments. And you'll see, I don't know if you've actually read Lives of Saints.
I have.
Well, there are two stories that are very clearly connected to two of the stories in Language of Thorns. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to take that lens and I wanted to show how different these stories were through different lenses.
There's so much to unpack there. I love that because that's deep into the weeds of things. I mean, perceptive readers from the Grishaverse novels going into this one will recognize that there are, this book basically kind of extrapolates on some of the references that are in the series. And indeed, like I mentioned at the top, Alina carries this book with her in the novels, right?
That's correct. And in the show, actually, she is handed this there's a chapter in Shadow and Bone. I actually went back and found it recently, where the Apparat, the spiritual counselor to the king, gives Alina this gift, this book, The Lives of Saints. And at the time, it feels almost like a threat. But he sort of understands the path that she is on. What he doesn't understand is how important this book is going to be to unraveling her path and to Ravka's future, because it proves to be an important key to the plot. Then to actually see it in Jessie, Jessie Maylie is playing Alina, and to see it in her hands was pretty extraordinary. And we thought it would be cool to recreate that prop, but I also didn't want to just do like, oh, it's a notebook or it's a journal. Like I really wanted to make this book as real as possible and to provide, I feel like this is a time of fractured focus. And so you have stories that you can truly gobble down that are, some are a page long, some are much longer, but that are sort of little bites of lore from the world.
I've talked about this a lot on the show, but I feel like book fandom for the longest time has really, you get the books and rarely is there much in the way of supplemental objects that you can collect or hoard as a fan. I feel like YA fandom, particularly in the wake of Harry Potter and stuff, like that's changed some, where there is a little bit more of a physical manifestation of collectability and fandom stuff, and you get things like pop figures and whatever. But I still think like the book community is underserved when it comes to having those types of items, and so I really think it's cool seeing something like The Lives of Saints that is both a standalone item on its own, but is also sort of an artifact of the series. And then, like you said, the upcoming Netflix series, so you get this physical tie-in. So, I think clearly there's a big part of the audience for the book are going to be people who are passionate about the Grishaverse and are going to be passionate about this stuff. And so, yeah, they get to have this, like, Alina carries this, now I carry this. That's meaningful from the fandom perspective.
I mean, I will say, I think it is a luxury and a privilege to get to create something like this. To even be able to continue to write in a series is highly reliant on readers not just staying with you, but pre-ordering your books and also ordering the first book in a series, not waiting for the whole series to be complete. Those things have all been sort of meaningful benchmarks in the life of the Grishaverse. But to be able to do a book like The Language of Thorns or Lives of Saints is, these are heavily illustrated, they're expensive to produce. And they're sort of gambles for publishers because they know they're only going to reach a certain number of people. who are interested in the world. And for me, the balance is obviously, it's easy to create merchandise. I don't want the books to ever become merchandise. And I wanted this to have enough substance for people to really feel like they were still getting a way to fall into the world and to sort of be tided over until the next novel that wasn't just, oh, this is a fun collectible.
I think about audiences and who things are made for a lot. And clearly with fiction, I mean, you can have books that are directly to a YA audience, but that hit older audiences as well. I think there's a lot more crossover back and forth between quote unquote adult fiction, YA, new adult, things like that these days. But when I was looking at this book, I was like, so the obvious target for this is the super fan of the Grishaverse. But I also think that this is a worthwhile look for a couple of other audiences and I don't know if this has ever crossed your mind or consideration, but one is just people who really do love folklore and that interesting crossover where magic and miracle, speaking specifically of religious miracle, meet. And I think that even if people are not well versed in the series, they might miss some references, but I think there's still something for people who enjoy that type of storytelling that they can get out of these short tales, because it does scratch a certain itch for that type of, folklore mythology. But where I think that a really interesting audience would be to find this is actually people who are really into role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that, particularly ones who are trying to create their own worlds. Because if you are essentially and I don't know if you've ever played any role-playing games, but there's a terminology called Homebrew, which basically means when people create their own game worlds that they just use just amongst their friends. And sometimes those worlds expand and become things they play for years. But I feel like reading a book like this is really instructive on how you would flesh out your own world. Look at what it would take to be like, oh, these things that exist in the background and inform the history of a place, this is how they form. This is how they're created, or this is how they're passed down. And so for me, from thinking of it as a writer and as a role player and as just a reader, I saw like multiple different versions that this thing works for me and that I could see it being valuable for different groups. So so I think it's very cool that it exists as like a kind of a keepsake. It also exists as a very interesting exploration of these ideas. But also, I think for writers, it's worth grabbing something like this because I think that they can consume this and it will fire up their own brains in an interesting way.
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. Yes, everybody go out and buy it. But also, and look, I think you never know when you're creating something really who it's for, I don't think, until the end. And even then, there's sort of a question mark attached to it. And there are certain books I write, like I knew Ninth House was not going to be for everyone. It is violent and strange and dense with digression, but it is very much the book I wanted to write. And with Lives of Saints, I think for some people, I hope it will be this kind of deep exploration of folklore and religion. And for others, I hope it will just be like a beautiful bathroom book, like the most beautiful bathroom book ever created. Like it has these stunning illustrations by Dan Zollinger. Like there's something very special about the book that they created. And you can take the half jacket off and just see it as this strange object. And the language that's on it is the Ravkan language that was created by David Peterson for the show, which I think is exceptionally beautiful. So yeah, I hope different people will discover it. I find writing short stories and short fiction to be quite challenging. And especially with a book like this, where there are 28 stories, to keep them fresh, to keep them engaging, to make sure that there's a sense of stake in them and that that they're not all one thing, not all bleak, not all joyful, not all any flavor, so that people feel that they've had a surfeit of that. I think that they're incredibly challenging. And so you hope that people won't just buy something for the sake of having it on their shelf, that they'll actually read the work that you put the time into.
I am curious, as you were constructing this, clearly it's been a number of years that you've been working on the Grishaverse books in general. There's a whole lot of them. And these mentions of these saints and of this book have occurred through so many of them. Were you actively building some of these stories as you were writing those, or are they more like footnotes that you came back to write this as a whole cohesive piece? Was it constructed over a long period of time, or was it a concerted effort?
Little of both. So I think when I am both a gardener and an architect, to use George R. R. Martin's metaphors. I am a plotter. I cannot write without an outline. I need to know where a story ends. I need to know the big moments that happen along the way, or I am incapable of finishing the novel. So in that way, I'm quite strict in terms of construction and structure. But I also think I keep the pleasure of writing alive for myself by creating doors to walk through and making sure there are spaces to explore. And that usually happens in character, in terms of character. Like I usually don't know a lot of my characters, the specifics of characters' backstory when I'm going into a story. So I'm getting to know them while I'm writing. And that's part of the joy of that first and second draft for me. And that's also true for the lore. So I'll create something like, Alina references, she compares Nikolai to the Two Clever Fox from a story she'd been read as a child. And in that moment, I don't know exactly what the story is, but I know what the effect of the story has to be in order for this character to embody this. And when I say, when I describe an illustration that Alina sees, I think one of the first saints I describe is in the Lives of Saints of the Apparat Hands are, Lizaveta of the Roses, lying drawn and quartered in a field. In that moment, I am trying to evoke the fear she has and the path that she's on as she becomes a religious icon herself. What lies ahead for saints? It's not usually it's not usually like, well, and then you go on a nice shopping spree and have a delicious lunch. Like there's usually blood and turmoil ahead if you're placed in this role. And so in that moment, I don't know what led Lizaveta to that field. And I don't know why and how she died. But I have this image that is operating both for me and the reader and the character, for all of us, as an understandable, visceral piece of language. So yeah, I knew backstories for a few saints, and but some were simply names on the page. And honestly, I wrote most of these stories. Lizaveta I wrote early because we needed something to show our artists to sort of give a sense of where we were going. But all of the other stories in the book, almost all of them were written actually on set of the show. I was visiting in Budapest and I sat in this little dark tent and had my headphones on, and I was, sort of peeking at the show, following what was going along, answering questions for production, and just huddled up in my parka because it's always ice cold on set, and writing these stories and trying to get them done.
That is a really curious origin story.
Yeah.
And there's something that informs any work which is just where the author is at the time, because you can't help but infest your mindset in a certain way. Some authors are clearly always holed up in an office somewhere and just cranking out work that way. And then others are globetrotting and writing wherever they happen to be at the time. And I can't help but get the idea that sense of place will always invade the work a little bit and inform it in different ways. So I almost like from a scholarly standpoint, somebody will be examining the work later on and like, well, she was in Budapest whenever this was being constructed.
I like that idea. I like the idea of just anybody trying to deconstruct the books and being like, well, as you know, when she was 5, she was bitten by an alligator. That is what was off of her work. I love that. The vision that of being treated academically is absolutely thrilling to me. So I hope that's true.
Well, and I love the revisionist history of the idea of being in like a stuffy college professor who's fresh out of Oxford and believes that every piece of fiction, every word is constructed with layers and layers of meaning and metaphor, and that if the curtain was red and peeled back in the scene, then it must represent the something.
I mean, I was an English major, so I have spent a lot of time, with an OED open next to me and doing exactly that and kind of breaking apart fiction in that way. And I do remember I remember one of my college roommates laughing because I got to take a poetry seminar when I was, I don't know, a junior or senior. And at the same time, I was taking a class called Biology of Fishes. So literally every poem I wrote was just full of fish metaphors and ocean, sea life. I mean, I'm not kidding you. There was a lot of like deep sea fishes and trenches and the like. And I remember my roommate laughing and being like, this, nobody would ever guess this is just because you're struggling to pass this bio class. I did much better in the poetry seminar than in the actual science course, which I did not belong in.
That's amazing. That I love that kind of backstory, because I think that we do like to mythologize the lives of writers and prescribe an incredible amount of meaning to every word on the page. And perhaps in the modern day that has, calmed down a little bit. But I was also an English major, and I dealt with those same kinds of things, being taught in class and occasionally wanting to just raise my hand and ask the teacher, I'm like, are you sure the person just didn't have a ham sandwich that day? And so that's why there's a ham sandwich in this scene? Because sometimes I think that's just the way it works.
I did take a poetry class with Harold Bloom, who,
oh my gosh. Wow.
I know. And he, on some days he was clearly just done. Like he was just done with everything. He sort of was this sort of big gray melted candle of a man. And he would just kind of like, he was so clear he didn't want to be there. But there were some days where for whatever reason he was enlivened and he knew all of these poets. He knew Wallace Stephen or Elizabeth Bishop. And he'd be like, I was getting drunk one night with it. And you'd be like, oh, so he does know. Like he absolutely knows what she was thinking when she wrote this poem. And that was quite thrilling. I also didn't really, I was such a heathen in college. Like I did not know enough to be intimidated by him. So I really think I got quite a lot out of that class. Although you may want to cut this because it's such a digression.
No, I love it. I love it. Keep going.
I was one of those students who procrastinated. I wrote my papers the night before they were due and I crammed for tests. And to be frank, I think it's one of the reasons that it took me so long to write my first novel, because I really hadn't learned the process of sitting with the anxiety of work and constructing something bit by bit and really building it. You cannot write a novel in a night, alas. And I was writing a paper for that seminar, and I wrote this into Ninth House. I had chosen Elizabeth Bishop's Late Air because I thought, okay, this is nice short poem I can write about. And of course, that was a terrible decision because then you can't even fill your paper with nice, long, juicy quotes to round out your page count. But I was exhausted and had spent all night working, and I went to drop my paper off at his office because that's what you did in the olden times. And I did not expect him to be there, but in fact, he was. And I was in my pajamas and a winter coat and had my hair in a bun and my glasses on. And he was there with some probably equally famous academic. And oh, charming lady, come in, charming. I'm so looking forward to your paper. And I'm just delirious and exhausted. Like I'm basically seeing double. And I said, well, thank you so much for your class. I really enjoyed it. It was fantastic. And I turned around to march out of the room and smacked right into the door that had closed behind me. And I pinged like a pinball off this door, just sort of, and, oh, charming lady, are you all right? I was like, get me out of this room immediately.
Oh,
it was
God.
Spectacularly humiliating. So that is my memory of college, of Harold Bloom. So there you go.
Oh my God, you lived a sitcom moment.
I've been the kooky neighbor my whole life. So yeah. Right there. But to pull us back to the idea of writing,
right?
And,
yeah.
I think it's worth noting too that very few things at least for me, get written in one place. I don't even have an office. I don't have a proper desk. I have a room that we call the office and that a lot of papers get thrown into and stacked up in. But for me, I've always been a laptop writer, and I move from room to room, and sometimes I write on retreat. And with most of my books, I've had to write some portion of them in hotels or now on set, and it's not always easy. I definitely prefer to be in a some kind of lovely setting and staring out at a view. But I think for most of us who are are working professionally, you can't be precious about the way that you can write.
Right. You just have to get the work done. Yeah. Wherever that environment is.
Yeah.
So something I'm interested in, I want to circle back in Lives of Saints here. You wrote this book, mostly a piece, based on bits and pieces of things that were generated during the original novels. How much work was it to align with those references? And
so much work. So much work. Like, I didn't understand. I have a very bad habit of doing this. It's like, oh, wouldn't it be fun if we did this thing? And I don't think through really what it means to write 28 miracles and martyrdoms and keep them interesting for readers. Like, I really did not understand what I was taking on. And I will say, too, that, you know, if you dive into actual saints' lives, they are not particularly inspiring. Like, you will see, if you have a background, particularly in the Catholic saints, you'll recognize some things, like in the story of Saint Nikolai and a couple of others. But the truth is, there's a sense of the arbitrary in miracles that doesn't fly, I think, for fantasy.
Right. Fantasy fans are not big on arbitrary. Magical realism, I think you get that sort of like ability to hand wave things and be like, yeah, it's cool. That just happened. But sort of notoriously, fantasy fans like rules. They like magic systems. They like things that kind of cohesively make sense. So yeah, I could see that could be a challenge.
Well, it's something that I even bumped into with Ninth House. I had people being like, oh, well, you know, why did you call this Book and Snake? And why did you call this? And I was like, because those are the names of the actual secret societies at Yale. Like, if I were building the secret society system at Yale, they would all, you know, there would be some cohesive theme. Like, they'd all be named after books, or they'd all be named after birds, or whatever it is. They didn't sit down and think, oh, you know, we should really have some kind of theme, guys. It was everybody doing their own attempt at the occult. So I was sort of bound by that. But I wasn't bound with these stories. I felt like there needed to be some sense of cohesion with the existing system of magic. And there is a kind of collision course in the books between Grisha magic, which of course they never refer to as magic, they call it the small science, and the miracles of the saints that many of the common people keep distinct from Grisha. And as these things get closer together, there's kind of especially in this new series, King of Scars, and its sequel, Rule of Wolves, there's a sense of these two things crashing into each other. So in the language of Thorns, you understood that some of what you were seeing was Grisha power, and some of it was superstition. And in the Lives of Saints, you'll notice that pretty much every saint, you could pull apart their miracles and trace them directly back to the small science, with only a few exceptions.
I think that dovetails really well with something that we were talking about earlier, was that idea of, even in the real world where, you know, we have these ideas of religious miracles and eras where there was no secular thinking, and, you know, things now we look at it and be like, well, we just call that magic, right? Or we'd call that a superpower. And depending on the time and the teller and the, you know, context of when a story is created, there different things are prescribed. Some things that we would look at and be like, some people would be like, oh, that's witchcraft and they need to burn. They're like, oh wait, he was a Christian. Oh, it's a gift from God, you know, or something like that. You know, it's like the perspective of the tellers.
Exactly. Is it a gift? Is it a curse? Is it a miracle? Is it an abomination? This is most definitely at the heart of so much of what I write, and the idea of what is really true in a story. And I think sometimes that's frustrating for readers, because I'll get questions like, well, was this really the Darkling sister? Was the Darkling the apprentice? You know, when I put this book out, I had a lot of people, when I published the table of contents, they were like, oh, is Nikolai dead if it says Saint Nikolai? And I'm like, no, this is his namesake. You know, this is the feast of Saint Nikolai is mentioned. I think it's in Shadow and Bone, but it's somewhere in the first trilogy, and he refers to his saint's day as being separate from his birthday as well. But I think sometimes there's a desire to draw literal connections between the characters and these supernatural forces.
Yeah, and I think it's always a challenge anytime that there's a name overlap in fiction, because, you know, in real life, granted, I have a pretty rare name and I have never in person run into another person with it. But for a lot of other people, they exist in a world where there's lots of people, you know, with a really, really similar, if not exact name. Yes. And in our fiction, we can't tolerate that, you know, like it's a really strange thing.
No, and there have been moments where I will accidentally use the name, and sometimes my copy editor will catch it and be like, it's the same person. I'll be like, no, I just apparently forgot that I had done that. And I am at a point now. Look, and to be clear, look, there are, I don't know how many books in the Grishaverse now, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 novels and 2 other books. No, maybe more. Anyway, but like, this is not, Discworld or Brandon Sanderson or, like, there's no, like, I don't have the kind of mind that creates, 27 book epics. I don't think I ever will. I think in sort of smaller story arcs. So I started out writing a trilogy. Then I added a duology that was set in a different part of the world. Then I returned to sort of the main characters or some of the secondary characters of that trilogy. For me, that is the way the world gets built. I have had vague ideas about what the arc of this series would be, but I've never had the kind of mind, and I wish that I did, that could plot over, potentially a 20-year, 30-year, 100-year saga. I wish I did.
Well, as a reader who doesn't have the mind who can handle those stories, at least not anymore, I appreciate short arcs and actually quite enamored with duologies as well.
Me too.
Those appearing on the scene and being a thing now, I think is very awesome because it defies that, I don't know, that absolute need, especially in fantasy, that it needs to either be a trilogy or it has to be 12 volumes over 50 years and whatnot. So,
well, I also think, like, I've always was a defender of the trilogy as this kind of like, this is the embodiment of the 3-act structure, but I'm not sure that's true because really the 3-act structure is a 4-act structure. It's first act, second act is broken into 2 parts.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, we always describe this in terms of the second act or the midpoint turnaround. But if you, and I, of course, being the pedant that I am, keep this in my outlines as, act 2A and act 2B, when really it could simply be 1, 2, 3, 4. And I don't know why I adhered to this, but I think the concept of the trilogy adheres to this, but it's really inaccurate. So to think of it more as, a duology is an act 1 and an act 2A, and the second half of the duology is 2B and your concluding act, I think makes more sense in some ways from a storytelling perspective, but I could probably get into a fight about that.
I like that you bring all that up because, I mean, you've mentioned that you're a meticulous outliner and that's a required thing for you. You've dropped the things about the gardener versus the architect and stuff like that. When we talked last in 2017, all those decades ago, at the time, you had mentioned sort of, I'm going to get the beats wrong if it was like 15 or 16 or 18 beat, but it's essentially kind of like Save the Cat kind of structure.
Yeah, I write to a 12 structure, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm curious as to, in the years since, how that's changed and evolved.
It hasn't. I still write to, it really hasn't. I write to a 12-beat structure. I write to a, 3-act structure. I would not say I'm a meticulous outliner. I think that there's a balance for me between an outline that leaves space to explore and a more thorough. The only time I've written a really detailed outline was when I was working on was with Wonder Woman Warbringer, when I was working on somebody else's intellectual property, and I wanted at every stage of that process to be getting a sign off, because I did not want to have to rewrite the book. So that was an important part of that process for me. I have, when I work, essentially 12 moments on a page that make up the novel, and things will certainly move and shift. But if I've nailed those down, I think it saves me a lot of pain later. And it's why I think I tend to write lean drafts that get longer on revision as opposed to something else. Now, the tighter my deadline, the more revision I tend to have to do and the more things I have to move around. And I will say this, I have learned to respect that each book has different demands within that process. So with Ninth House, because I was writing it between other projects, and I didn't have the luxury of setting aside a big chunk of time for it, I had to dedicate a part of that time at every turn to rereading what had come before. And that's something I never used to do. I used to really think about it as, that zero draft, that first draft, you're careening through and just trying to maintain momentum, and you don't look back. It's Lot's wife. If you look back, you're doomed. And with Ninth House, I had to keep in order to keep straight where my characters were emotionally, I have 3 timelines operating. I needed, and to remember who knew what when, I needed to continually reread, revise, and then proceed forward. So that for me, each book is a little bit different that way. But the actual foundational structure and process has never changed. And I don't think it will. I think it's like a security blanket for me.
Well, I like that you mentioned the process of having to sort of reread your work while you're working on Ninth House. I think when you have the authors who are working at these 12, 15 novel series that go on forever, whether it's urban fantasy or, like you said, the things like Brandon Sanderson, I feel like those worlds are second skins for an author at a certain point.
Right.
They can slip right back into it. Notably, I feel like there's a tangible difference in the feel of, say, like the original Grisha books, the original trilogy versus Six of Crows. Clearly similar world, but like tonality, there's a shift.
Very different.
Yeah, and it feels very different, and clearly very different into something like Language of Thorns, and then Ninth House has to be very, very different yet. How much do you feel like is like coming home whenever you come back to Grishaverse, or does it feel like you're refiguring it out every time versus, like you said, what you were doing with Ninth House?
No, the Grishaverse is very comfortable to me at this point, and there's an upside and a downside to that. So the upside is it is very comforting to return to, and I can step into the plots of these books and the experiences of these characters with a surety that I certainly didn't possess earlier in the series. And at the start of a book or when working on a standalone, I don't think I have that. You are discovering as you go, you're getting to know the world, getting to know the characters. And in a book like Ninth House, that's set in a real place like Yale, there's a different kind of research and it takes a different part of my brain, I think, to sink into that process. The downside is that the Grishaverse, those rules become constrictive at some point. And the geography of a place can become constrictive. If I have this damn mountain range here, I can't very well just move it. and I have cursed my decisions and my maps at various points. But I think also it doesn't really belong to me entirely anymore. Now that the show exists or will exist, but it exists on film now, and even the way that I interact with readers has changed. It belongs to me, but it belongs to Eric Heiser. It belongs to every cast member. It's just not wholly mine anymore. And that's a very strange feeling.
That's something I really wanted to hit on too. You've mentioned the Netflix show several times, and certainly the focus of this particular program is not on, getting deep into the weeds on adaptions and things. But from the writer perspective, I'm really curious about your input on the show, and particularly when we talked, several years ago, one of the things that we spoke about was kind of when you hit the point of being several years away at that point from Shadow and Bone, and thinking about how that first series is pretty straight and white. It echoes some of the things that were prominent in YA at the time versus Six of Crows, where I feel like you break that mold in a big way. And to me, I think Six of Crows shifted the landscape of YA, because I think a lot of the novels that have followed have echoed Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom in a lot of ways. And I don't say that saying that they're derivative or anything. I just think that it's sort of like a watershed moment in that particular subgenre, because I think it changed how some of the stories could be told. I also think it really popularized heist novels in that zone.
I'm so sorry for all the writers who then went out to write heists. For me as a writer, there's a certain amount of self-consciousness around Shadow and Bone, particularly the first book in the series, because it is so deeply entrenched in trope and in the Chosen One narrative. But I also think there's a reason that those narratives never die. They are sort of deep in our DNA. When Eric and I first sat down to talk about the show, one of the first things we both raised was the idea of making sure that our cast for that part of the series, because the series does touch on both Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows and brings those stories together, which I know has provoked some anxiety within the readership, but I really am very happy with the way we progressed through that. But, to make sure that it was a more diverse and inclusive cast. And Eric also, unlike a lot of people who in Hollywood who talk a good game, went out of his way to make sure that we also had inclusion within our writing room and with those behind the scenes and in the director's chair. And there are always, obstacles to that in terms of being able to get the people that you want and making sure that schedules link up. But I think it's something that you can feel in the work and in the kind of camaraderie that grew up first in the writer's room and then on set. I think that comes through in the show, and I think speaks to Eric's talent for bringing together kind of, he'd be very good at a heist, because I think he knows how to build a team. And as far as my role, early on in production, I was in the writer's room. I would come in, not every day. I was writing King of Scars at the time, and I would come in every week or 2 weeks, and they would pitch me essentially the outlines of the episodes that they were breaking. And we would talk through things I was concerned about or things that I hoped for. And it was a lot of fun. Very cool group of people, and I always laughed a lot and always felt great after coming out of those discussions. Of course, there's a big leap from outline to script, and then from script to approved script, and then from approved script to episode, and then from episode to rough cut, and from rough cut to final cut. And, there's a level of iteration that puts what we do with novels to shame in television, and a lot changes at every step. And I would say I had the most influence at the beginning, and my influence lessened at the more people who were in the room. That doesn't mean I wasn't still putting my 2 cents in, because that's my nature. But I think it is collaborative and requires compromise in a way that is not always comfortable for authors, or for me in particular, because we're used to sort of being off on our own and having a tremendous amount of control over story.
I think from fandoms, there's always a little bit of trouble when people are really, really connected to source material and then it gets adapted, that it can be difficult for fans sometimes to accept the fact that there cannot be a one-to-one perfect adaptation.
No. And how deeply boring that would be, I think, for them.
Yeah.
I at least for me, and again, it will be the readers and the new audience who decides what they make of the show. But for me, I think we're bringing something sort of exciting to the table that keeps the heart of these stories, and you will recognize these characters do not seem like different characters. They are very much the characters from the books. And you will recognize many scenes from the books, but they have been brought together, I think, in a fresh way that offers something to readers to say, you not only have the books now, you have this too. And I think that we approached it, in a very different way than a lot of adaptations have. And I like it. I may use those words. I may be chased off of social media in the future, but for me, I think it was very successful and did some cool things that we didn't do in the books. It's a totally different medium. And I will say too, I've tried to really give Eric and Netflix credit for this. The work of authors is precious to Hollywood people. I talk about them like they are a different species, but they almost are. It is precious to them until they own it. You are the genius in the room being offered the world and being told you are spectacular until they own it. And then I have seen again and again authors be treated with tremendous contempt in relationship to their material. And I think it is worse for women authors. And I think it is even worse for women authors of YA, because there is a desire to, or an impulse to, undermine both the work we create and the audience that consumes that work. And I've been very grateful, because I feel like I've never felt that contempt from Eric or from the writers and from our team at Netflix. I've been very grateful for that. And that I think comes through in the adaptation.
Well, hopefully that is a trend that continues.
I hope so.
That's been some really bad adaptations. You can see that they did not respect or care for the source material.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. We've all had that where something you love has been trashed. It is not a good feeling.
That sense of being a viewer and watching something where you can feel the sense of contempt that the studio or even the people who are creating it had for the original materials versus the ones where they clearly love it.
And the sense of understanding. Like there's sometimes a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes something delicious.
That's a good line there. I like that. Before we wrap up, I do have one last question, which is just what is it like to stand face to face with your own characters?
Oh, God. Archie, the actor Archie Renaud, who plays Mal, continuously gives me shit for the fact that I cried. I mean, I'm one of those people who cries at everything. I cry when I'm angry. I cry when I'm happy. I cry, at commercials for the ASPCA. Like it's not hard to make me cry. So he really should not feel that proud about it. But I remember very clearly walking onto set that first day, and it was incredibly disconcerting. There were all of these people in kefta and First Army uniforms just sitting around, smoking, drinking coffee, talking on their cell phones. And so that was the first bizarre part of this. And then we walked into a soundstage, and they had a sort of big prop set up there, and Jesse and Archie were already in costume, and I just lost it. It was incredibly emotional and strange. And there have been moments along the way where now when I write particular characters, I hear the voices of the actors in my head. And that's who I see now when I write them, and I don't mind it. I think we got very lucky, and we have not only an incredibly charismatic and talented cast, but their love for each other is just delightful, and we were on set. They had been, I got to visit a couple of times, but they had been there for months, living away from family and loved ones and in a foreign city. And they were still, you'd hear them laughing and singing together in the green room. And I thought, this is something special that happened here. And I hope and believe that it will show in the relationships of the characters on the screen.
If there's anything that we've seen, especially in genre storytelling, especially in television, is that shows that have a cast that love each other, it shows up in the fabric of the program. I think they last longer. I think they affect audiences differently. I mean, I think the really good example is Supernatural, how you have a cast and crew that adore each other, and it, and they've run 16 seasons or something at this point.
I would settle for 5. I would settle for 15, but that is definitely God, our actors would be so old by then. That is a crazy thing to think about. They're so delightful and so many of them came out of theater and smaller roles, and you can see it in their training and their professionalism, and they are just good people. So I'm proud of them. I'm not somebody with tremendous maternal instincts. I've never wanted kids, but they've brought something out of me where I'm like, I will protect these babies at all costs.
Including Ben, who is, has been around for a while.
I was going to say, you're referring to Ben Barnes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a huge fan of him because of Westworld.
Tremendous actor. I know he's very handsome, but he's also just a fantastic actor.
And everything that I've gathered from behind the scenes stuff, he always just seems like a delightful human being in general.
He is. We have no bad eggs. I mean, who knows what'll happen on season 2, but we have no bad eggs. We have all wonderful human beings who love to hang out and who are, Ben and Kit showed up. Kit is playing Jasper, and they showed up at one of my signings for no reason other than they're great humans. And everybody was so thrilled. The readers were thrilled, and there was much shrieking. It was fantastic. But
I was going to say a lot of squee. Yeah.
Well, Ben is used to all of this, Ben just oozes charm wherever he goes. But Kit had never experienced anything like this. And Kit has many fans from his work in theater, but this was a whole other thing. And you could see the shock in his eyes. I felt a lot of love from them. They've all read the books. I've loved talking to them about the characters. And again, you never know how the work, you see the work in bits and pieces when it comes to adaptation. So I really don't know what the final product will look like. And I really don't know how it will be received, but I feel glad for the people I've met in the process, and I feel glad for the experience. And I think not a lot of authors get to say that at the end of the day.
Well, everything you said about it there makes me very excited for the series. Of course, here we want to make sure that audiences are excited for The Lives of Saints.
Yes, please be excited. And Rule of Wolves, which is coming in March, which I don't know. It's always, but I had so much fun writing this book. Maybe because it was written in quarantine and I was so happy to have this world to be in. And it is a wacky book. It has so much stuff happens in this book. And I think it is full of feels and sadness and tragedy, but it is also a really fun novel. It's full of magic and ridiculous things happening and characters, finding each other, being torn apart, finding their way back to each other. I really enjoyed writing it, and it reminded me of the feeling I had when I was working on the first books, Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows, where you feel like anything is possible. So I hope people will pick up Lives of Saints. It's not a bad introduction to the Grishaverse, and I hope people will join me for the end of the King of Scars duology with Rule of Wolves, because I'm pretty excited about it.
Well, I think in a time period where things are very rough on people psychologically, it's really good to have things to look forward to. So, so that completion book, I think, is going to be an important part of that. I also I think Lives of Saints will fit very well alongside of The Language of Thorns, in the sense that it is both a worthy addition to the lore of this world, but also this great standalone keepsake. Anecdotally, I will throw out that I was on a Zoom call with my writers group last night, and I mentioned that I was going to be talking to you today, and I mentioned what the book was, and my writer friend, Kara Hecker, immediately just reached off to the side of the camera and then just produced Language of Thorns on screen, just manifested it out of nowhere, and was like, she was like, oh, is it like this? And I was like, well, yes and no, more no, but yes. But I loved that was, for a person who's a fan of your work, it was ready on hand, because it's like one of her favorite things. And yeah, I think that stuff is very cool. So like I said at the top, The Lives of Saints is out October 6th, in all the places, but this is definitely one you're going to want a physical copy of, because it is very pretty. Yes, people who are looking at this online, that is a half jacket on it. It is not a half red, half blue cover. There's a jacket telling you the title.
No, you can take the jacket off and just have the beautiful red fake leather cover. And I'll say too, I'm going to be reading, I had readers vote on what they wanted to hear, so I'll be reading The Tale of Sankt Nikolai, who is the patron saint of sailors and impossible causes. And I'll be reading that on Instagram Live on October 6th. And I'll also be doing a bunch of tour events for that and for the Ninth House paperback in October. So if you're not sick of hearing me talk, there will be many other opportunities to hear me talk with other authors. And yeah, please come visit.
Yeah. Where should people follow you? What are the best places? The website, the socials.
The best place is on Instagram, L Bardugo, just the letter, not like El Bardugo, just L Bardugo on Instagram. And also I'm on Twitter. I don't tweet very often. I do tweet updates there, but I don't interact as much there anymore because it was eating my mind. So Instagram is the best place to find me. You can also find me at leighbardugo.com. I believe Grishaverse.com, which is run by my publisher, also has all of the information for that series. And I really do we do mostly Q&A at events, because I love to talk to people, and I genuinely miss touring so much. Oh, I should also mention we have a Shadow and Bone Collector's Edition that's coming out in the US and the UK. 2 different covers, and they're both quite beautiful.
I've seen pictures of those, and those are gorgeous. Yeah. Again, readers are underserved in getting some of those beautiful keepsake editions. So I love that your readers are not deprived. There's a lot of very cool things coming out.
They're the reason they exist. So thank you to the readers who actually go out and buy these books, and because publishers don't do them for every series. And
And even with something like Language of Thorns or Lives of Saints, like, again, like, short stories are a hard push for most readers. I think SFNF readers are, particularly adult SFNF readers, are more invested in sort of short fiction, and that's an incubator for a lot of authors. But it is hard to, unless you're Neil Gaiman, it's hard to make a bestseller out of a collection of short stories. So I feel very grateful for everybody who goes on the ride with me.
Well, as a short story fan myself, I appreciate when these things arrive. I think they're a nice break from the doorstopper 9,000 page novels and stuff. So, and also as somebody who has to read a lot in order to do the show, things that are brief and read fast are so welcome in my home. So,
Well, you're welcome.
Yeah, I dig it. So, well, again, Lives of Saints is great. Please go pick it up. And Leigh, thank you so much for joining me again on Fictitious.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun. Thank you for the chat, and thank you to everybody for listening.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this interview, hit like and subscribe, and tell me what your favorite Leigh Bardugo book is down in the comments. You can also listen to Leigh's previous appearance on Fictitious in this video, or check out some of my other recent episodes with other great authors.